Hey everybody. Um, this is a piece by Lars Rensmann, titled "Israel-related antisemitism: Forms, History, Empirical Findings." I'm using a this article is in German. I'm using Google Translate, so the translation might not be particularly precise, but I think it's enough to. It typically works well enough to get the overall gist. Um, this article is from 2021. What exactly, and this is like the description for the piece, what exactly is Israel-related anti-Semitism? How can it be distinguished from non-anti-Semitic statements about Israel? What is its history and historical precedent, and how does the phenomenon manifest itself today? And the table of contents for this piece says, first, what is, quote, Israel-related anti-Semitism, and, quote, definitions, characteristics, forms. Recognizing anti-Semitism, figurations and examples of Israel-related anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment and the Nazi legacy, on the history of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. Israel-related anti-Semitism is a form of modernized anti-Jewish sentiment after 1945. Interaction dynamics of normalization and repoliticization, on the presence of Israel-related anti-Semitism, concluding remarks on the limits of what can be said in anti-Semitism as a barometer for democracy. So here we go. Just as the idea of a, quote, ground zero was a social myth in other areas in 1945, anti-Semitism did not disappear from German society after the Holocaust and the end of the National Socialist reign of terror. Democratization processes undoubtedly had significant political and cultural effects in the history of the Federal Republic. Public debates about the Nazi past and discursive boundaries laboriously established through conflict, as well as legal sanctions in some cases, have also ensured that openly anti-Semitic speech lost its social acceptability over time. Anti-Semitism was thus publicly suppressed. However, over the past 20 years, anti-Semitic resentment, which sometimes persisted as an undercurrent in society, has once again gained legitimacy and acceptance in the public sphere. The, quote, boundaries of what can be said, and, quote, have expanded again. Furthermore, since the beginning of the millennium, anti-Semitism has once again increasingly become the subject of political mobilization in Germany and Europe, and not only in the right-wing extremist and neo-Nazi spectrum. Even open verbal anti-Semitism has flourished in recent years, thanks to the use of new social media, and, quote, alternative and, quote, global disinformation media. In European democracies, variations of a modernized anti-Semitism remain prevalent, employing, among other things, various codes and illusions. Two aspects are striking here. One, on the one hand, alongside forms of subtle Holocaust relativization and trivialization, new conspiracy myths are emerging. These ultimately almost always portray Jews as the, quote, puppet masters, end quote. This is no coincidence. Anti-Semitism is the historical conspiracy narrative par excellence. A prominent example are the claims that behind either a global, quote, great population exchange, end quote, or the coronavirus, the Jewish patron George Soros would be the most prominent figure in this context, although his Jewish identity is often not explicitly mentioned. On the other, an aggressive hostility towards the Jewish state acts as an important medium for articulating and spreading contemporary anti-Semitism. Israel, the internationally, quote, most important and striking symbol of Jewish life and survival, end quote, as well as against, quote, the Zionists, end quote, a now almost universally used cipher for, quote, the Jews, end quote. Anti-Semitic conspiracy myths and hostility towards Israel often appear together. Precisely because Israel plays such a significant role in Jewish identity today, Israel-related anti-Semitism is present in almost all forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, coded and unfiltered, verbal, and sometimes violent. Furthermore, references to Israel and, quote, the Zionists, end quote, make it possible to spread anti-Semitic sentiments without having to talk about, quote, the Jews, end quote, and thus make one less vulnerable. Countless examples demonstrate the extent to which expressions of anti-Semitism today are amalgamated with anti-Israel sentiment as an element and justification strategy and how they affect society. Following an arson attack on the Wuppertal synagogue in July 2014, which can clearly be understood as an anti-Semitic act of violence against the Jewish community and Jewish citizens in Germany, the responsible district court initially denied any anti-Semitic motive for the attack. The male perpetrators had merely wanted to, quote, draw attention to the Gaza conflict, end quote, which is why there was no, quote, no evidence, end quote, of an anti-Semitic act. Thus, the district court itself adopted an anti-Semitic logic in its ruling, according to which Jews are generally held responsible for hatred of Israel, and which denies or trivializes anti-Semitic violence against Jews by referring to Israel. Only a regional court later reversed that ruling on appeal. Israel-related anti-Semitism, like hostility towards Jews in general, is not limited to a particular social group or political movement. Rather, it is evident across all social classes and levels of education, as well as in otherwise sometimes very, very heterogeneous political movements, media and organizations, from organized right-wing extremism and Islamism. It extends into left-wing political groups and milieus, from various new protest movements like the, quote, Yellow Vests, end quote, to corona deniers and conspiracy theorists on, quote, alternative media, end quote. But it can also be found in mainstream society, established institutions, and reputable media. But what exactly is, quote, Israel-related anti-Semitism, end quote, and how can it be distinguished from both non-anti-Semitic statements about Israel and other forms of anti-Jewish sentiment? What is the history and historical precedent of Israel-related or anti-Zionist anti-Semitism? And how does the phenomenon manifest itself today? New section. What is, quote, Israel-related anti-Semitism, end quote? Definitions, characteristics, forms. Anti-Semitism has a long and complex history, and accordingly it has many faces. Anti-Semitic hatred of the Jewish state of Israel has been one of them since its founding. Despite some changing or modernized forms and diverse social functions, anti-Semitism is essentially the modern form of the old Jew hatred, a hostile, resentment-driven attitude towards Jews and Judaism. The general working definition of the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, understands anti-Semitism as, quote, a certain perception of Jews which may find expression in hatred of Jews, end quote, and is directly rhetorical or violently against Jewish and non-Jewish individuals, as well as Jewish institutions and religious facilities. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition and the forms it refers to are now recognized in academic research on anti-Semitism, as well as by the German federal government, the European Parliament, and numerous other political institutions. Ever since the journalist Wilhelm Marr sought to give his hatred of Jews a pseudo-scientific justification in the late 19th century, the then invented word, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, has been used to describe all forms of hostility towards Jews. On the one hand, anti-Semitism refers to a generalizable dimension. It is directed against Jews as a group, community, or minority and encompasses discriminatory practices, forms of institutional exclusion, and the negative attribution of supposedly collective characteristics. In part, such attributions can be viewed analogously to other forms of group-related or racist misanthropy. However, even early anti-Semitism research before the Nazi era has shown that anti-Semitism cannot be generalized. The specific dimensions of anti-Semitism differ significantly from conventional prejudices and mere false generalizations. For centuries, anti-Semitism has functioned, for example, during the devastating plague in the Middle Ages, the cause of which remained unknown at the time, particularly as a conspiracy myth that repeatedly culminated in the persecution of Jews. In the modern world, anti-Semitism has condensed into the idea of a, quote, Jewish world conspiracy, end quote, or a pattern of explaining the world that can appear as an individual attitude and cultural interpretive foil in everyday social communication, but also publicly and politically. Anti-Semitism functions as an identity-constituting phantasm that boundlessly imbues the complex world with diverse, sometimes openly contradictory, ideas about Jews. Traditional anti-Jewish imagery, resentment, and persecution practices have evolved into a specific, quote, anti-modern ideology, end quote, in modern society. quote, which personifies in all Jews, quote, which personifies in Jews all social and psychosocial problems, contradictions, and transformations, end quote. Rensmann. I don't know if it says Rensmann 2004. Rensmann wrote a book on the history of critical theory, Frankfurt School, and the study of anti-Semitism. And I don't know if that's what he's referencing or not. Jews thus appear as the masterminds of world unrest, of capitalism and communism at the same time, as embodiments of money, usury, abstraction, modernity, and urbanity, as well as of base, primitive greed, vindictiveness, and sexual decadence, of cosmopolitan universalism and merciless particularism. The distinctive feature of anti-Semitism thus lies primarily in its function as a boundless projection surface for fears, wishes, and longings, as well as universal, concise, quote, explanation, end quote, of all conflicts in the modern world. They are attributed to the, quote, disintegration, end quote, of society, or the nation from which they are to be excluded. Anti-Semitic enemy images tend to target the whole. The well-being and survival of the nation and humanity depend on the elimination of the Jews. Anti-Semitism is, quote, precisely what it claims to be, a deadly danger to Jews and nothing else, end quote. Arendt. Israel-related anti-Semitism projects corresponding anti-Semitic sentiments onto the Jewish state of Israel and its modern democracy. Like anti-Semitism in general, Israel-related anti-Jewish sentiment offers an enormous reduction in complexity. Multifaceted social changes and conflicts are reified into the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, and the problem of the Jewish state. This form of anti-Jewish sentiment is directed against Jewish Israelis, as well as against Jews in the diaspora, who identify with Israel as, quote, Zionists by external attribution, or who themselves identify with Israel. The Jewish state attracts the hatred of anti-Semites from various social classes and political persuasions and has become a, quote, primary projection surface for anti-Jewish conspiracy-based fantasies, end quote. In this process, Israel is the, quote, Jew among states, end quote. Leon Poliakov, one of the first big scholars of the Holocaust, and its Jewish citizens are collectively segregated, attacked, and demonized from the global community of states or legitimate citizens. The cited IRA definition indicates prominent manifestations, among others, the attempt to hold Jews collectively responsible for the state of Israel, the equation of Israeli policies with those of the Nazi regime, the use of classic anti-Semitic imagery to characterize Israel and its citizens, demonization and the application of double standards regarding Israel compared to other democratic nations, the denial of a Jewish right to self-determination, and the assertion that the existence of the Jewish state is a, quote, racist endeavor, end quote. It's interesting with the genocide charges, which preceded October 7th, and preceded the very, very real, I'm not going to say it's very real death toll and devastation that's happening in Gaza. That lots and lots of people argue that tend to accuse Israel of genocide, and since its very inception, generally also kind of tend to feel as though the Holocaust is a sort of not really an exceptional event in human history, but is a reflection of generalized brutality, particularly in the expansion of empires, and that genocide has happened all across the world prior to the Holocaust. Considering that they think that the Holocaust is or that genocide is such a general feature of human history, which you can debate or not. The only genocide that Israeli actions, the actions of the Israeli state, are compared to, are that of the Nazis. You never hear, it's they never talk about like Rwanda or something like that, or Cambodia. It's always the Nazi analogy, right? And it's never just, it's not just fascist. I mean, I think you can say that within the Israeli state, there is tendencies that you can 100% call fascist. Um, for instance, Kahanism. Um, Plenty of Zionists talk about the fascist qualities of the Israeli far right. Um, but it's always to the Nazis, right? So it's always to the comparison is always to Auschwitz and the Holocaust. It's never a comparison to any other atrocity. Where am I? As with other forms of modernized anti-Jewish sentiment, Israel-related anti-Semitism, which uses the Middle East to articulate anti-Semitic ideas, often does not explicitly attack Jews as Jews. Such an understanding, see among others Klug, 2014, I think it's Uli Klug, I'm not sure, would inadequately capture modernized anti-Semitism anyway. Rather, anti-Israel projections enable a, quote, roundabout communication, end quote, that transfers anti-Semitic resentments from Jews to the Jewish state and Jewish Israelis without openly insulting or discriminating against them as Jews. Although in numerous cases of Israel-related anti-Semitism, linguistic transitions into accusations against, quote, the Jews, end quote, are quite fluid. For example, in adaptations of classic anti-Semitic sentiments, quote, Zionists, Israelis in the Jewish state appear as particularly, quote, evil, or, quote, unscrupulous, and, quote, bloodthirsty, quote, child murderers, as, quote, ritual murderers, as global, quote, scheming masterminds who, quote, manipulate opinions, as, quote, greedy, or, quote, parasitic, and as the sole cause of violence and unrest in the Middle East. Verbal anti-Semitic indirect communication is also capable of legitimizing and unleashing direct violence against Jews. Anti-Israel anti-Semitism, like other forms of anti-Jewish sentiment, constructs in a specific way an allegedly overwhelming and unscrupulous power of Jews, which appears existentially threatening and consequently justifies violence against Jews as self-defense, thus ultimately aiming at their annihilation as a, quote, fight against evil, end quote. And that's an important thing about anti-Semitism. That I think is a very important thing is I feel like the main stereotype and conception about Jews is their evilness and their power, evilness and power, and I feel like the word that always seemed to me to most encapsulate the anti-Semitic worldview is the concept of Jews as diabolic. It always seemed like the word to me, but that's just my opinion. So there's always a kind of certain like little guy defeating the there's always like the humble little people fighting against these evildoers is often the framing of an anti-Semitic worldview. The Jews are the reason, where the Israelis are the reason there's so much suffering and violence in the world. Contrary to what is sometimes suggested in public debates, the distinction between objective criticism of politics or government action and Israel-related anti-Semitism, which discriminates against and demonizes the Jewish state and its citizens, is relatively simple. Objective criticism takes a factually based, concrete position on specific issues. It is open to objections, argues on the basis of verifiable facts, and is open to rational counterarguments. Overall, it aims at reality-based assessments and seeks to identify concrete opportunities for change, and thus political behavior options demonstrate as misleading as it would be automatically as misleading as it would be to automatically equate criticism of Israeli government policy with anti-Semitism, which empirically rarely happens. It is just as patently false to claim that, quote, criticism of Israel, unquote, cannot be anti-Semitic, as the British University and College Union UCU claims. Especially in the context of emotionally engaged journalistic and political, quote, criticism of Israel, unquote, Israel-related anti-Semitism is repeatedly declared a, quote, controversial issue, unquote. See, for example, Wolfgang Benz, 2020. In doing so, the differences between criticism of Israeli government policy and anti-Semitism are blurred by redefining anti-Semitism as, quote, criticism. In this context, the claim that Israel-related anti-Semitism does not even exist is not uncommon. Rather, these are merely exaggerated accusations of anti-Semitism, allegedly used to, quote, silence and quote, critics of Israel. From the perspective of social science research on anti-Semitism, however, the analysis and evaluation of the phenomenon of Israel-related anti-Semitism has long ceased to be controversial and generally does not represent a, quote, gray area, end quote. For a critique, see Hartman 2020, and for the social science understanding of Israel-related anti-Semitism, see, among others, Bayer and Liebe 2013, Heider, Iser, and Schmidt 2005, Markowitz 2004, Rensmann 2004, Salzborn 2020, Schubert 2020, Schwartz, Friesel, and Reinhardt 2013. New section. Recognizing anti-Semitism. Figurations and examples of Israel-related anti-Semitism. 6 typical examples and configurations are mentioned in which anti-Semitism towards Israel manifests itself explicitly and implicitly. This is anti-Semitism, for example, when 1. Quote, the Zionists, end quote, are stylized as a collective, quote, threat to world peace, end quote, or the small state of Israel is inflated into an existential problem of, quote, humanity, end quote. In this way, a classic construction of modern anti-Semitism is mobilized, quote, the Jews, end quote, as, quote, enemies of humanity, end quote, and, quote, warmongers, end quote, who endanger, quote, world peace, end quote. The code word, quote, Zionist, functions not as a reference to those who advocate the right to Jewish political self-determination, but as a synonym for, quote, the Jews, end quote. 2. Agitation is being waged against an alleged, quote, child murderer Israel, end quote. This updates the anti-Semitic fantasy of the, quote, ritual murder accusation, end quote, not quite widespread in global culture. No comparable accusation exists against any other group or country, even though children are victims of armed conflicts worldwide in large numbers, not least in far greater numbers in other armed conflicts in the Middle East, such as the Syrian war. Yeah, you never heard people on the left call Assad a child murderer. Furthermore, an exclusive deliberate perpetration is being constructed that demonizes the Jewish state. The Jewish and Arab children who fall victim to the Islamist terror of Hamas and Jihad are being ignored in order to construct an anti-Semitic accusation of guilt against the Jews. 3. Israel is described as a, quote, foreign body, end quote. AfD politician Alexander Golland, in a debate article in the daily newspaper Welt in 2001. Such terms lend themselves to arguments seeking to isolate or delegitimize Israel from the community of nations. Anyone who claims, for example, that, quote, Zionism is, quote, a racist crime against humanity, end quote. Parenthesis, Vuz Ozaguz on muslimmart.de, and thus constructs Israel as a particularly evil state, not only denies any political self-determination or statehood for Jews exclusively, but also defames all Israelis and the vast majority of Jews worldwide, for whom a positive relationship with Israel has long been part of their Jewish identity. 4. Jews or Jewish Israelis, regardless of their political orientation, are exclusively called upon to distance themselves from Israel in order to be allowed to participate in cultural or academic events. This is, for example, one of the demands of the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which is considered anti-Semitic, directed at Jewish Israelis. It updates the forced conversion tradition from Christian anti-Semitism, according to which Jews could supposedly escape institutional exclusion or persecution if they renounced their Jewish identity in Judaism or offered, quote, atonement, end quote, for their sins. Jews in Israel itself are blamed for anti-Semitic hatred, which is always based on fantasies. This reversal of perpetrator and victim crystallizes, for example, in the notion that violence against Jews and Israelis based on their identity is ultimately a, quote, reaction to Israeli state terrorism, end quote. This motive is also evident in the statements of the late FDP politician Jürgen Mühlmann, who claimed during the 2002 federal election campaign that, quote, hardly anyone has given the anti-Semites, who unfortunately exist in Germany, more support than Mr. Sharon, bracket, the then serving Israeli prime minister, end bracket, end quote. That Jews themselves are to blame for the hatred against themselves is an accusation from the arsenal of classical anti-Semitism. Yeah, no one in the world would ever say the double standards on anti-Semitism are astounding, because no one on the left, and I'm speaking specifically of the left, not fucking people who are racists that talk about anti-Semitism in out the side of their face, in people who only give a shit about anti-Semitism to the effect that it's another way to shit on leftism, which is true, which is a real phenomenon. Like people on the left, I'm talking about specifically on the left, would never ever blame a group for their own stereotypes which is no one would say like, oh yeah, this wouldn't be the stereotype, if so and so group didn't act this way. No one would say that. Like no one on the left would say that. People on the right would say that, for sure, but not people on the left. Well, people on the left would say, oh, there wouldn't, if black people didn't act this way, there wouldn't be all these prejudices against them, or something like that. They would never, like a right winger would say that, but a left winger would never say that. But they would say that about Jews. They would say, Israel's terrible, therefore anti-Semitism, and therefore not only does it explain it, oftentimes it's usually used as a justification for it as well. There's I can't remember what the piece on the channel is called, but it's by Norman Garris, who wrote for years for New Left Review. There's a lot of insightful things to say about the Middle East and anti-Semitism. And he talks about this. He has this thing called the Israel alibi, where anti-Semitism is apologized for by the left because of things that Israel does. It's understandable, which is crazy, right? But yeah. Anyway, 6. It is claimed that Jews react, quote, oversensitively, end quote, and deliberately exploit dishonest, quote, accusations of anti-Semitism, end quote, to supposedly, quote, immunize or, quote, silence political criticism of Israel. This defense is itself an anti-Semitic insinuation. The trope that Jews maliciously seek to profit from anti-Semitism and accusations of anti-Semitism and attempt to, quote, beat down, end quote, those who express anti-Semitic views with, quote, anti-Semitism clubs, end quote, or later, quote, Auschwitz clubs, end quote, has flourished not only since the post-war period. Through this narrative, quote, accusations of anti-Semitism, end quote, in relation to Israel-related anti-Semitism are declared to be fundamentally, quote, abusive, end quote, unfair, and the real problem. Ultimately, a, quote, Zionist lobby, end quote, is suspected to be behind this, quote, abuse, end quote, meaning the sinister activities of Jews. The reversal of perpetrator and victim that accompanies this denial of anti-Semitism is typical of the history of anti-Semitism in general. It is also found in motives of guilt relief and the defense against memory of the National Socialist genocide. For example, the desire to equate the Jewish state and its policies of the National Socialist criminal regime and the unprecedented mass murder of European Jews. In light of German and European responsibility for the Shoah, the accusation against Israel as a, quote, unjust state, end quote, assumes the functions of a, quote, secondary anti-Semitism, end quote, because of Auschwitz, which fends off critical remembrance of its own perpetrator history and seeks to ideologically transfer guilt onto the victims. At the same time, by portraying Israel as, quote, settler colonialism, end quote, the colonial European legacy can also be delegated in a relieving manner and projected onto the Jewish state. Like anti-Semitism in general, Israel-related anti-Semitism operates independently of reality. Although crises within this territorial conflict are repeatedly used for anti-Semitic mobilizations, however, the social reality of the Arab-Israeli conflict is more a cause of anti-Semitism than a military conflict in Africa is of racist discrimination. Accordingly, the many Palestinian victims in the brutal cross-border civil war in Syria are rarely discussed. Even in Israel-related anti-Semitism, the speaker's origins initially play no role, because what matters is the meaning of resentment emanating from society, of course. Jews can also spread anti-Semitism by referring to Israel. However, Jews are particularly affected by anti-Semitism as personified objects of anti-Semitism directed against them. This is particularly evident in schools. Jewish students and teachers today are often confronted with anti-Semitic enemy images, especially those that have an Israel connection. Anti-Israel sentiment and the Nazi legacy on the history of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. Hostility towards Israel and diffuse hatred of, quote, the Zionists, end quote, as a fantasized enemy image have become a central medium for articulating anti-Semitic resentments, far beyond Germany and Europe. However, this Israel-related or, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, anti-Semitism is not, quote, new, end quote, as the talk of, quote, new anti-Semitism, end quote, suggests. Israel-related anti-Semitism has been present throughout the history of the 20th century and long before the State of Israel was founded. Its most relevant precursor in National Socialism. The racist annihilating anti-Semitism of the Nazi propaganda had a decidedly anti-Zionist flank since the early 1920s, decades before the founding of the Jewish state, with Hitler and subsequently especially the strongly anti-Semitic Protocols of the Elders of Zion. For the Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, who was influenced by the Nazi ideologue, quote, Zionism, hatred of, quote, Zionism early on became part of an anti-Jewish, propagandistically mobilized delusion that soon overshadowed non-anti-Semitic criticism of Zionism by Jews before the founding of the State of Israel. The fantasy of Zionism as an agent of a Jewish world conspiracy quickly became a, quote, cornerstone of Nazi ideology, end quote. Weber, 2013. Over 100 years ago, on August 13, 1920, Adolf Hitler, in his programmatic speech, Why Are We Anti-Semites?, develops his idea of a national state in contrast to the Zionist state attempt in Palestine. Quote, the entire Zionist state shall become nothing but the last perfected institution of their international scoundrelry, and from there everything shall be directed, end quote. Quoted in Phelps, 1968. This statement demonstrates the influence of Rosenberg on Hitler mentioned above. The latter wrote numerous articles in as early as 1922, a popular book against the idea of a Zionist state and the allegedly, quote, anti-state Zionism, end quote, combining anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist agitation until the 1940s. Similar to the now pejorative, collectively derogatory use of, quote, the Zionists, end quote, as an anti-Semitic code for, quote, the Jews, end quote, Rosenberg viewed, quote, all Jews as Zionists and Zionists as representatives of all Judaism, end quote. I think the quote is from, it's a secondary source quote by Nicosia, 2012. Rosenberg's central anti-Semitic premises are reflected in the anti-Zionist denunciation of the idea of a Jewish state as a supposedly rootless, illegitimate, quote, entity, end quote. A narrative that was further disseminated after the Nazi era by numerous right-wing, left-wing, Arab nationalist and Islamist groups and movements. This includes, in particular, the ideology that Zionism was not a movement aimed at realizing or today defending state territorial Jewish political self-determination, but rather a global Jewish conspiracy. That Jews were not a genuine people and that no legitimate state could be formed with the evil Jews. Recent historical studies demonstrate the close intertwining of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic indoctrination during the Nazi era, even in the Middle East itself. Anti-Semitic Nazi radio propaganda and the practical Nazi recruitment of Muslims in the Arab world absorbed traditional Islamic anti-Judaism and aimed at a struggle against Jews and Zionism in the Middle East, waged jointly by the Nazis and local elites. In the course of this transnational history of entanglement, new forms of Islamic anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic Islamism, in which a Jewish state in the Middle East, as well as Jews in general, are stylized as existential enemies of Islam. In these anti-Semitisms, a global conspiracy ideology imported from Europe and Nazi Germany merged with regional Islamic traditions of contempt and humiliation of Jews to create something specifically new. After the Holocaust, corresponding Israel-related anti-Semitic ideologisms from the Middle East again spread in Europe. These include, for example, religious anti-Semitic charges of unconditional hostility towards Israel and anti-Semitic redemption narratives of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and the delusional idea that, quote, the Zionists, end quote, are the cause of every conflict in the Middle East. A look at history also shows that Israel-related anti-Semitism was not solely a reaction to the founding of the State of Israel. Rather, it preceded the Holocaust and the flight of survivors to local Jewish communities in the Middle East. Furthermore, Israel-related anti-Semitism is not exclusively fueled by motives of repression and guilt relief of German crimes and European collaboration. These motives can, of course, play a role when it is claimed that the Jewish state treats Palestinians essentially the same way Nazi Germany treated Jews, as has repeatedly happened in debates about Israel in Germany and Europe since the founding of the Jewish state in 1948. New section. Israel-related anti-Semitism is a form of modernized anti-Jewish sentiment after 1945. In the post-Holocaust era, hatred of Israel became an outlet for expressing otherwise increasingly discredited anti-Semitic sentiments. Initially, however, it was primarily former and new National Socialists who continued to agitate against Jews in Israel, while many West European leftists turned to So there's a fucking messed up thing. While many European leftists, first, precisely after the, I don't know, it's a fucking weird sentence. While many leftists turned precisely for this reason express solidarity or identify with the Zionist project and its socialist kibbutzim, in contrast to the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic line of Stalinism and post-Stalinism. But the latest with the Six-Day War in 1967 and the rise of the New Left in Europe at the end of the 1960s, parts of the left became the representatives of a, quote, socially acceptable, end quote, anti-Semitism, which was conveyed particularly through the medium of anti-Zionism in the name of unconditional, quote, Palestine solidarity, end quote. In the anti-Semitic tradition, the small state of Israel was increasingly stylized as a great superpower and demonized as rootless and unscrupulous, quote, imperialist, quote, colonialist, or even, quote, fascist, quote, foreign body in the Middle East, end quote, and as a perpetrator nation, quote, apartheid state, end quote, while Arabs were imagined exclusively as their victims or, quote, Jews of today, end quote. Corresponding verbal and sometimes physical anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish community and Jews in the diaspora associated with Israel have often been alloyed with a supposedly, quote, anti-fascist or, quote, universalist self-image in the claim of moral superiority. This stylization of Israel as a great superpower was only rarely disturbed by the fact that Hitler once fantasized that a small Jewish state in the Middle East could become the center of global conspiracy power and should not exist. Israel-related ideological, quote, refinements, end quote, and modernization of anti-Semitic tropes and images subsequently found their way into the mainstream of the public and media, partly through national conservative voices, but also increasingly through left-wing or left-liberal actors. At the same time, an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-Semitism has always been a core component of the extreme right, remained. New section. Interaction dynamics of normalization and repoliticization on the presence of Israel-related anti-Semitism, on the right wing. As indicated, such anti-Semitism has increasingly become a means and object of political mobilization in recent years, even within European democracies. The neo-Nazi spectrum throughout Europe has traditionally been particularly open in its fantasies of annihilation of Israel. This applies to large parts of the European right-wing extremism, for which anti-Semitism continues to be an ideological binding force. Quote, Zionists are identified as enemies of ethnic nations, colonized peoples, or all of humanity. There is often talk of a conspiracy by a, quote, Zionist-occupied government, end quote. Adapting Heinrich von Treitschke's openly anti-Semitic slogan, quote, the Jews are our misfortune, end quote, from 1879, the neo-Nazi party, titled The Right, on posters and demonstrations, including in front of synagogues, the barely veiled slogan, quote, stop Zionism, Israel is our misfortune, end quote. The term, quote, Israel functions here as a mere means of indirect communication to avoid criminal prosecution for incitement to hatred. For example, the right-wing extremist National Democratic Party of Germany, NPD, Israel-related anti-Semitism in the common context of anti-Jewish global conspiracy myths. The party supports the, quote, fight for, quote, the liberation of Palestine, end quote, as well as the anti-Israel campaign, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. New section, on the left spectrum. BDS is not only being propagated by right-wing extremist anti-Semites throughout Europe and the world. Celebrities such as the musician Roger Waters supports the movement and vents anti-Semitic sentiments that are tolerated by the campaign itself. For example, Walters identifies Jews with pigs, in which he paints stars of David. But sections of a post-colonial and culturally relativist left in Europe and the US are also using the BDS campaign to perpetuate the tradition of left-wing Israel-focused anti-Semitism outlined here. Anti-Semitism manifests itself in the BDS campaign, alongside the tolerance of anti-Jewish sentiments expressed by activists such like Waters and BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti, who advocates for the, quote, euthanasia, end quote, of the Jewish state. Wikipedia says Omar Barghouti, born in 1964, is founding committee member of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel and a co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. He received the Gandhi Peace Award in 2017. Back to the text. Among other things, and calls for boycotts of Israeli Jews as well as Israeli goods and institutions. However, given the goals of the BDS initiators, the very existence of the Jewish state is in question, or rather, its abolition is to be feared. They do not limit themselves to the territories occupied as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, but also demand a right of return of all Palestinian refugees and their descendants who emerged from this conflict. In other words, several million people. A lot of them also being no longer being refugees in the sense of they are citizens of states, such as, for instance, Jordan. Publicly expressed criticisms of BDS is thus reinterpreted by the boycotters and their public supporters, such as Evelyn Hecht Galinsky on the Querfront conspiracy myth platform Ken FM. Querfront means like cross-front, so like cross-front between right and left. As a, quote, speech ban, end quote, allegedly promoted by a, quote, Israel lobby, end quote, that in reality seeks to stifle criticism of Israel with political intent. This semantics was evident in Germany, for example, in debates about the left-wing American BDS advocate, philosopher, and Adorno Prize winner Judith Butler, who supported the anti-Semitic jihadist terrorist organizations Hamas and Hezbollah. And declared them, quote, part of the global left, end quote. And most recently, the post-colonial thinker, I can't remember how to pronounce his name, Achille Mbembe, who teaches in South Africa. Before his planned opening speech at the Trinala 2020, Mbembe faced public criticism, including from Felix Klein, the federal government's anti-Semitism commissioner. Mbembe had repeatedly compared Israel to the Nazi regime and attributed to the Jewish state fantasies of extermination and the intention to, quote, dispose of Palestinians, quote, dispose of Palestinian life like garbage, end quote. Mbembe, who stylizes the, quote, occupation of Palestine, end quote, disregarding, for example, the hundreds of thousands of deaths in neighboring Syria or numerous genocides as the, quote, great moral scandal, end quote, of our time, insist in this context, in the tradition of Christian anti-Semitism, that the God of the Jews is a vengeful God, each cited in parenthesis, each cited in Kauba 2020, in parenthesis. In 2018, Mbembe expressed solidarity with protesting BDS activists over the participation of Jewish Israeli researchers at a conference in Stellenbosch, South Africa. Mbembe announced that he would not attend the conference on whose organizing committee he served as long as the organizers did not reach an agreement with the protesters. Shortly thereafter, Israeli psychology professor and peace researcher Shifra Zagi was removed from the event program. These examples demonstrate a hostility towards Israel. These examples demonstrate a hostility toward Israel, permeated with anti-Semitic elements and discrimination against Jews based on their origins, which also appears to be tolerated in certain left-wing milieus. Recently, numerous left-leaning representatives of German cultural institutions even saw censorship in a Bundestag resolution recommending that the BDS movement no longer be supported financially and logistically with public funds. Referring to Mbembe and BDS, they complain that, quote, important voices are being sidelined by the misuse of the accusation of anti-Semitism, end quote, which is giving rise to, quote, great concern, end quote, about, quote, freedom of expression, end quote, in Germany. Despite the fact that, quote, Israel-critical, end quote, positions, including those of Mbembe, whose opening speech at the Ruhrtrinale which was canceled due to the coronavirus crisis, was published in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, are given extensive media coverage. Contrary to this controversial discourse is precisely the method of various BDS actors to disrupt or prevent discussion events, even by Israelis critical of the government, unless they commit to BDS and or exclude Jewish Israeli citizens from international discussions through boycotts. For example, the Oslo Human Rights Film Festival citing BDS, rejected a documentary film on the grounds that it was by an Israeli, until he made a film about the, quote, illegal occupation, and, quote, his films would not be shown. And in June 2017, for example, a BDS group attempted to prevent a discussion with Israeli Holocaust survivor Deborah Weinstein at Berlin's Humboldt University with loud protest. New section. In Islamism, or the Islamist spectrum, Israel-related anti-Semitism is, after all, a fundamental component of the political ideology of Islamism, in whose diverse radical and Islamist formations, the demand for the destruction of the Jewish state forms a common denominator and circulates. The genesis, ideology, and violent practice of political Islamism are unthinkable without anti-Semitism. This applies both to militant terrorist actors and to primarily legally operating organizations of, quote, political Islam, end quote, operating within the migrant democracies of Europe. Israel-related anti-Semitism and the desire for Israel's destruction, under the pretext of, quote, Muslim self-defense, end quote, against, quote, child murderers, end quote, are particularly prominent. Islamist interpretations of the world construct, quote, Zionists as, quote, Zionists as global, quote, anti-Muslim, quote, conspirators behind Western modernization and is responsible for crises in the Muslim world. Accordingly, various radical Islamist movements in Germany participate in the annual Al-Quds March in Berlin, which glorifies the terrorist Hezbollah and calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. New section. In the right-wing populist spectrum, Israel-related anti-Semitism also finds outlets and public platforms in the increasingly successful European right-wing populism. This party presents itself as pro-Israel in some quarters. However, sections of the electorate and the party elite are significantly influenced by anti-Semitic beliefs that shape the view of Jews and Israel as a whole. These beliefs range from a nationalist relativization of the Holocaust to the anti-Semitic conspiracy myth that Jewish philanthropist George Soros is orchestrating global migration flows and a, quote, great population exchange, end quote. With regard to the Alternative for Germany, AfD, the largest opposition party in the German Bundestag since 2017, according to recent studies, a total of 29% of AfD voters are manifestly right-wing extremists, and another 27% have latent right-wing extremist attitudes. Anti-Semitism stands out in particular. According to a representative survey conducted by the University of Hamburg in 2016, 59% of AfD voters said, quote, the influence of Jews is great, end quote, in contrast to 16% of all other parties. According to a 2018 survey by the Allensbach Institute for Public Opinion Research, 55% of AFD voters believe, quote, Jews have too much influence in the world, end quote. Anti-Semitism is thus proving to be a majority attitude among the AFD electorate. Although some right-wing populist actors, parties, and movements in Europe, such as the Dutch politician Geert Wilders' PVV, while some parties emphasize that they stand by Israel, this relationship usually turns out, upon closer analysis, to be instrumental for domestic policy goals such as deterring Muslim immigration. This partially positive reference is also, as empirical studies show, overshadowed by various forms of anti-Semitism, including anti-Semitism directed against Israel. A relevant example of this is again the right-wing populist AFD. While the party leadership opposes the anti-Semitic and anti-Israel boycott movement (BDS), including with the motion in the Bundestag, condemn the BDS movement. In parentheses, AFD chairman Jörg Meuthen further emphasized that the AFD stands, quote, for Jewish life in Germany and for Israel, end quote. Finally, the party also likes to refer to the small group, quote, Jews in the AFD, end quote, and sometimes views Israel as a, quote, geopolitical alliance partner against the supposed, quote, Islamization of Europe, end quote, end quote. However, this supposed, quote, solidarity goes hand in hand with the construction of an ethnically homogeneous state of Israel, which itself reproduces anti-Jewish images. The thin veneer of this supposed primarily anti-Muslim, quote, solidarity with Israel is, and how quickly it gives way to open Israel-related anti-Semitism, is demonstrated, for example, by the official reaction of the AFD to the April 2018 report that Israel wanted to deport refugees to Germany. Quote, a complete fool's game. Israel wants to get rid of illegal immigrants from Africa, and who does the, quote, choice fall on? Once again, it's like a word here, it says Germany. Which I guess is a play on words, end quote. So, I don't know. End quote. Screenshot and quoted in Reba 2019. Here the party uses the anti-Semitic image of Israel, claiming that Jews are, quote, financially squeezing Germany, quote, because of Auschwitz, end quote. Quote. See Reba 2019. Wolfgang Gedeon, a Christian fundamentalist, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semite, a former member of the Baden-Württemberg state parliament, who has since been expelled from the party, still has supporters in the AFD. New section, in the middle of society. The repoliticization and remobilization of anti-Semitic resentment by the various political actors mentioned above is not only partly accompanied by violent attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, along with anti-Israel justifications. Furthermore, they interact dynamically with the normalization of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on social media and in the cultural sphere, as well as a partial mainstreaming of Israel-related anti-Semitism in the political public sphere. There are numerous examples of this in the media and politics, even recently. To name just two from Germany and Great Britain, Der Spiegel, co-owner and editor-in-chief of Freitag, Jakob Augstein, updated centuries-old anti-Semitic ideas regarding Israel, claimed that the Israeli government was, quote, leading the entire world by the leash of a rising war song, end quote, and following, quote, the lull of revenge, end quote. Anti-Zionist Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the British Labour Party, the oldest and perhaps most important social democratic party in Europe, fostered an anti-Jewish climate within his party for years, according to an independent investigation by the official British Equality and Human Rights Commission. Israel-related anti-Semitism and the tolerance of anti-Semitic invectives by elected officials at all levels of the party were particularly evident. Furthermore, Corbyn himself, as a declared, quote, friend of Hamas and Hezbollah, end quote, advocated, quote, standing up against the Zionist lobby, end quote, supported Holocaust deniers, and claimed that the English-born, quote, Zionists, don't understand English irony, end quote. Such persistent mainstreaming of a, quote, honorable anti-Semitism, end quote, parenthesis, Jean Amery. I have a bunch of pieces by Jean Amery on this channel, in parenthesis, which has long appeared across the political spectrum and, according to Amery, has been made, quote, honorable precisely by a less historically preoccupied left, sometimes claimed for itself by actors in the media and public institutions, despite significant discursive power. Not only the attitudes of a courageous breaking of taboos, moreover it encounters a persistently strong social resonance of anti-Semitic myths in general, and of Israel-related anti-Semitism in particular. This is confirmed by empirical findings from social science surveys and social research. According to a representative survey from 2018, for example, 26.6% of participants in Germany agree with the statement that, quote, given the policies that Israel pursues, end quote, is understandable, quote, that people have something against Jews, end quote. For more than a quarter of the population, their own perception of Israeli politics appears to legitimize an anti-Semitic attitude. Even with the explicit and implicit expressions of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, it must be considered that heterogeneous factors play a role in motivating attitudes and political behavior among individuals. For example, those who tolerate the anti-Semitism of BDS activists like Waters and engage in the campaign do not necessarily harbor subjective anti-Jewish feelings or intentions themselves. However, the empirical correlation between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism is robust and very high. Furthermore, it is hardly possible to comprehensively reconstruct the intentions and emotions of individuals empirically. The objective socially shared meaning of anti-Semitic expressions, regardless of what is supposedly, quote, meant, or whether an expression was, quote, intended that way, end quote, is rarely disputed in research. Concluding remarks on the limits of what can be said in anti-Semitism as a barometer for democracy. It is an urgent challenge for society as a whole and our liberal democracy to redraw the gradually eroding boundaries of what can be said regarding anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not an opinion or a respectable contribution to discourse that Jews must, quote, endure. Anti-Semitism in any form is about exclusion, demonization, and ultimately verbal and physical violence against a minority. Anti-Semitism, however, contains specific elements of a world conspiracy myth and a global fantasy of redemption and annihilation, which separates it from mere prejudice. A prejudice can be refuted if the individual allows for reasonable arguments and subjective experiences. Anti-Semitism, on the other hand, offers an enormous ideological reduction of complexity, which summarily declares and reifies the multifaceted problems and ambivalences of the modern world in our time, including the complex conflicts and interests in the Middle East, as an Israeli, quote, Zionist or, quote, Jewish problem, end quote. The socio-psychological dynamics of Israel-related anti-Semitism also aim at its elimination. Raising awareness about this is a requirement of school and political education. The extent to which our society allows itself to indulge in anti-Semitism affects not only the Jewish minority, whose institutions still require police protection. Rather, the way we deal with anti-Semitism and the limits society sets for it are the most important indicators of a liberal democracy and its political culture. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.